You watch others effortlessly command respect and get exactly what they want, while your reasonable requests fall on deaf ears. Every day you see less qualified people manipulate situations to their advantage, leaving you wondering why your honest approach consistently fails while their subtle machinations succeed brilliantly. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying power, how it's gained, how it's kept, and how it's lost. In the treacherous world of Renaissance politics, I discovered that those who understand human nature hold the keys to influence, while those who rely on goodness alone become victims of their own naivety. What I learned about strategic control will transform how you navigate every relationship and situation in your life. The same principles that allowed princes to rule kingdoms can help you master the art of influence in your personal and professional world, turning you from someone who hopes for cooperation into someone who commands it naturally. Whether you're managing a team, negotiating a deal, or simply trying to get things done, the strategies that shaped empires will reshape your approach to human interaction. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of strategic influence. I was born into a world where power shifted like sand beneath your feet, where today's ally became tomorrow's executioner, and where a single miscalculation could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. Florence in my time was not the peaceful city of art and culture you might imagine. It was a viper's nest of competing families, foreign armies, and papal intrigue, where survival depended on understanding the hidden currents of human ambition. My father, Bernardo, taught me early that in Florence's information was currency and relationships were investments. I watched him navigate the dangerous waters of local politics, carefully balancing his loyalties between the Medici and their enemies. From him, I learned my first lesson in strategic thinking. Never reveal your true allegiances until you understand everyone else's. When I entered government service at 29, I thought I understood power. I was wrong. True power, I discovered, wasn't about the title on your office door or the size of your army. It was about understanding what motivated each person around you and positioning yourself to either satisfy or threaten those motivations. Spent 14 years as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, conducting diplomatic missions to kings, popes, and emperors. In those courts, I witnessed masterclasses in human manipulation. I saw how Pope Alexander VI used his children as political weapons, how Louis XII of France maintained power through carefully calculated displays of both mercy and ruthlessness, and how the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian's indecision made him a pawn in everyone else's game. Each mission taught me that successful leaders shared common traits. They understood human nature deeply, they never relied on others' goodwill alone, and they always had multiple strategies running simultaneously. Most importantly, they recognized that people respond to incentives and consequences, not to moral arguments or logical appeals. The real education came when the Medici returned to power in 1512, overnight. I went from trusted diplomat to suspected enemy. I was stripped of my position, briefly imprisoned, and exiled to my small farm outside Florence. This reversal taught me, perhaps, the most valuable lesson of all. Power is temporary, but the principles that govern human behavior are eternal. During those years of exile, I had time to reflect on everything I had observed. I began to see patterns in how people gained influence, maintained it, and lost it. I realized that those who succeeded understood that human nature operates on predictable principles, and those who failed either ignored these principles or hoped they didn't apply to their situation. What I discovered in those formative years still governs every interaction you have today. The same forces that determined who lived or died in Renaissance Italy determined who gets promoted, who gets the best deals, and who commands respect in your modern world. If you want to understand true power, you must study those who wield it. Without apology, in 1502, I was sent on a diplomatic mission that would change my entire understanding of influence and control. I was to observe and report on Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, a man so feared that his name alone could empty a room or fill it with trembling courtiers. Cesare was not born to his position, he seized it. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, he had murdered his way to power, eliminated his rivals with surgical precision, and built a state through pure will and strategic brutality. When I arrived at his court in Imola, I expected to meet a savage. Instead, I encountered a master strategist who understood human psychology better than any scholar. My first lesson came during our initial meeting. Cesare kept me waiting for 3 hours in his antechamber, not out of disrespect, but as a calculated demonstration. When I was finally admitted, he apologized with such apparent sincerity that I found myself grateful for his attention. Later, I realized what he had done. He had established the power dynamic before we even spoke a word. Fear and love, he told me during one of our conversations, are both useful, but fear is more reliable because it depends on something you control, consequences, while love depends on something you don't control, other people's emotions. He had learned this through experience. Leaders who relied solely on being loved were overthrown the moment their subjects' affections shifted. Leaders who inspired fear lasted until someone more fearsome appeared. But Caesar's genius lay in his understanding of calculated mercy. After conquering the Romagna, he could have ruled through terror alone. Instead, he appointed Ramiro d'Orco as his governor, a man known for his cruelty. D'Orco restored order through harsh measures, making Caesar's rule seem lenient by comparison. Then, when order was established, Cesare had d'Orco executed publicly, appearing to protect his subjects from tyranny while demonstrating that no one, regardless of their service, was beyond his reach. I watched him manipulate alliances with the same precision. He would promise support to multiple parties in the same conflict, keeping his options open until the last possible moment. His word was never given lightly, but when circumstances changed, he adapted without hesitation. Flexibility, he explained, is the difference between the tree that bends in the storm and the one that breaks. During my months at his court, I observed how he gathered information. Every servant, every visitor, every minor official was a potential source of intelligence. He knew not just what his enemies were planning, but what they were thinking, what they feared, and what they desired. This knowledge allowed him to anticipate their moves and position himself advantageously. Caesar's downfall came not from his methods, but from circumstances beyond his control: his father's death, and his own illness at the crucial moment when the papal succession was decided. Even then, his strategic thinking almost saved him. He had planned for contingencies, built alliances, and prepared backup positions. What he couldn't plan for was being struck down by fever at the exact moment when his presence and decision-making were most crucial. From Cesare, I learned that power is not a birthright or a gift, it's a skill that must be constantly practiced and refined. The same principles he used to conquer states can help you conquer challenges in your professional and personal life. Understanding that influence comes not from good intentions, but from strategic thinking and calculated action. Let me share with you a truth that will make some uncomfortable. Complete honesty in a competitive world is not virtue, it's naivety. I learnt this lesson painfully through watching good men destroyed by their own transparency, while calculating men prospered through strategic information management. During my diplomatic career, I witnessed the fall of Piero Soderini, the well-meaning Gonfalonier of Florence, Soderin believed that honest dealing and good intentions would protect the Republic. He shared his strategies openly, trusted his enemies' promises, and assumed others operated with his same moral framework. When the Spanish and Papal armies approached Florence, he continued negotiating in good faith while his enemies had already decided his fate. His honesty made him predictable, and predictability made him powerless. Contrast this with Pope Julius II, whom I observed during several diplomatic missions. Julius never lied outright, but he never revealed his complete intentions either. When negotiating alliances, he would emphasize different aspects of the same truth to different parties. To the French, he spoke of his desire for Italian independence. To the Spanish, he emphasized his commitment to Catholic unity. Both statements were true, but neither revealed his ultimate goal, expanding papal territory. Strategic deception is not about fabricating false realities. It's about controlling the flow and timing of accurate information. When I negotiated on behalf of Florence, I learned to reveal my position gradually, always maintaining informational advantages. If I was authorized to offer 1,000 florins for a treaty, I would begin by suggesting we might consider 500, then reluctantly move to 750, creating the impression of costly concessions while remaining well within my actual mandate. The key insight is that people make decisions based on incomplete information, and the person who controls which information is available when has tremendous influence over those decisions. This doesn't require dishonesty, requires strategic timing and selective emphasis. Consider your modern workplace negotiations. When discussing a potential project, the person who reveals their full budget first usually pays more than the person who explores the other party's expectations first. When negotiating a deadline, the person who immediately accepts an aggressive timeline has less leverage than the person who explains the challenges involved before committing to what's actually achievable. I developed what I call the layered revelation strategy. Like an onion, you reveal information in layers, each one providing enough truth to maintain credibility while preserving your strategic advantages. The first layer establishes your general position and good faith. The second layer reveals your constraints and concerns. Only in the final layer do you reveal your full capabilities and final position. The moral complexity of this approach troubled me initially, but I came to understand that in competitive environments, pure transparency often serves no one's interests. If you're negotiating a business deal and immediately reveal your maximum budget, you haven't served your company's interests or helped the other party understand the real value of what they're offering. You've simply eliminated the discovery process that leads to optimal outcomes. The boundaries of ethical strategic deception lie in the distinction between withholding information and providing false information. You can choose what to reveal and when to reveal it. You can emphasize certain facts over others. You can allow others to make assumptions without correcting every misunderstanding immediately. But the moment you provide actively false information, you've crossed from strategy into dishonesty. Master this principle in any negotiation or competitive situation. The person who maintains informational advantages while gathering intelligence about the other party's true position holds the stronger hand. Your transparency should be earned through reciprocity, not given freely as a gesture of goodwill. In all my years of studying power, I have discovered that human nature operates on three fundamental drives that transcend culture, time, and circumstance. Master these three forces: fear, greed, and pride, and you will predict and influence behavior with remarkable accuracy. Ignore them, and you will be perpetually surprised by the actions of those around you. Fear is the most primal and reliable motivator, not the paralyzing fear of immediate physical danger, but the subtler fear of loss of status, security, opportunity, or control. During my observation of various courts, I noticed that the most effective leaders never eliminated this fear entirely, but channeled it productively. They created environments where people feared the consequences of inaction more than the risks of action. I watched Pope Julius II master this principle when forming the League of Cambrai against Venice. He didn't threaten the other Italian states directly. Instead, he painted vivid pictures of Venetian expansion, helping them visualize what they would lose if Venice continued unchecked. Their fear of future loss motivated them to accept present risks. In your modern context, this same principle applies. People respond more strongly to avoiding loss than to gaining benefit. When presenting a proposal, lead with what maintaining the status quo will cost, not just what change will provide. The manager who worries about falling behind competitors will act more decisively than one who simply sees an opportunity for growth. Greed, the desire for more, is equally powerful, but requires more careful handling. I don't mean simple monetary greed, though that certainly exists. I mean the deeper human hunger for advancement, recognition, and accumulation of advantages. The key insight is that people will act against their stated principles when they believe the potential gain justifies the compromise. I observed this during negotiations between Florence and France. French nobles who proclaimed their honor and loyalty would shift positions when offered the right combination of land, titles, and commercial privileges. They weren't corrupt, they were human. Their definition of reasonable gain simply exceeded their attachment to their current position. Understanding individual greed patterns gives you tremendous influence. Some people hunger for public recognition, others for private security, still others for intellectual stimulation or social status. Identify what each person truly wants to accumulate, and you understand their decision-making framework. Pride is perhaps the most complex and dangerous of the three drives. It can make people act irrationally, reject beneficial offers, and pursue courses of action that serve no practical purpose. But it can also inspire extraordinary effort and commitment when properly channeled. I learned about pride's power through studying Cesare Borgia's relationship with his subordinates. He never made his commanders feel small or expendable, even when disciplining them. Instead, he would frame corrections as helping them live up to their reputation, or protecting their honor from those who might question their capabilities. By appealing to their pride, he gained not just compliance, but enthusiasm. The critical insight about pride is that it's often more important to people than material gain. Someone might accept a smaller salary to work for a company that enhances their reputation, or choose a more challenging assignment to prove their capabilities. Pride can override both fear and greed when skillfully engaged. Reading these motivations requires careful observation. Listen not just to what people say they want, but to what makes them emotional. Fear reveals itself through defensive language and concern about worst-case scenarios. Greed appears in their fascination with opportunities and their questions about potential benefits. Pride shows up in their sensitivity to perception and status. The most sophisticated people are driven by combinations of these forces, often in conflict with each other. An executive might fear the risk of a new initiative while being greedy for the potential rewards and too proud to admit uncertainty. Understanding these internal tensions allows you to help them resolve their conflicted motivations in directions that serve your objectives. Practice this in every important interaction. Ask yourself which of these three forces is primarily driving the other person's behavior. Then consider how you can address their dominant motivation while avoiding unnecessary triggering of the others. This awareness will transform your ability to predict responses and craft persuasive approaches. During my years in Florence, I discovered that the most powerful people rarely paid for anything with money alone. They dealt in a different currency entirely: favors, obligations, and mutual dependencies. The Medici family didn't control Florence through force or wealth alone, but through an intricate web of personal debts that bound hundreds of people to their interests. Lorenzo de' Medici, whom I studied closely, understood that when you do someone a favor, you create something more valuable than gratitude. You create obligation. Gratitude is an emotion that fades with time and circumstance. Obligation is a psychological contract that influences behavior long after the original favor is forgotten. I learned this principle through personal experience when I fell from grace in 1512. Those who had received favors from me during my time in power were the ones who quietly helped me survive my exile. Not because they loved me, but because they understood that abandoning someone who had helped them would damage their reputation for reliability. My past favors had created a form of insurance that protected me when formal power could not. The key insight is that people respond more consistently to obligation than to logical arguments. When someone owes you something, they will often act in your interest even when it's inconvenient for them. When they merely agree with your position, they'll support you only when it's easy. Building your favor bank requires strategic thinking about timing and selection. The most valuable favors are those given when someone truly needs help, not when they're already comfortable. A favor provided during someone's crisis creates exponentially more obligation than the same favor offered during their success. I observed this during the various sieges and political upheavals of my time. Those who helped others during dangerous periods earned loyalty that lasted decades. Cosimo de' Medici built his power by providing financial support to struggling nobles during their family crises. Years later, when he needed political support, these same nobles felt compelled to assist him, even when it put their own interests at risk. The strategic deployment of generosity requires understanding what each person truly values. For some, the most meaningful favor is public recognition or introduction to influential people. For others, it's private assistance with personal problems or access to exclusive information. The art lies in discovering what someone needs most and being positioned to provide it before they ask. Modern applications of this principle are everywhere around you. The colleague who helps you with a crucial project when you're overwhelmed will earn your future support more effectively than one who simply does good work in general. The person who introduces you to valuable contacts when you're job searching creates a debt that influences your behavior long after you've found new employment. But building obligations requires patience and genuine value creation. Superficial favors or obvious attempts to create debt often backfire, making people feel manipulated rather than grateful. The most powerful favor builders focus on providing real help that the recipient couldn't easily obtain elsewhere. I developed a practice of maintaining detailed mental records of mutual obligations, who had helped me and how, whom I had assisted and when. This wasn't bookkeeping for its own sake, but strategic awareness of the relationship dynamics that would influence future interactions. The reciprocity principle works because humans are psychologically uncomfortable with unbalanced relationships. When someone has helped us significantly, we feel internal pressure to restore equilibrium through return favors. This discomfort motivates action even when the logical benefits aren't apparent. Master this. View every interaction as an opportunity to either build credit or collect on past investments. But remember that the most powerful favor bank is built through consistently providing value to others, creating a reputation for reliability that makes people want to maintain positive relationships with you. In the courts and chancelleries of Renaissance Italy, I learned that information was the ultimate currency of power. Not gold, not armies, not noble bloodlines, but knowing what others did not know, and knowing it first. The difference between success and failure, between life and death, often came down to who possessed the most accurate and timely intelligence. During my diplomatic missions, I developed an extensive network of informants that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Servants in foreign courts, merchants traveling between cities, clerks in government offices, even priests in confessionals all became sources of valuable intelligence. I learned that people in seemingly insignificant positions often possessed the most revealing information about their superiors, true intentions and capabilities. My greatest intelligence coup came during negotiations with the French court. While other diplomats focused on formal meetings with ministers, I cultivated relationships with the king's personal servants. Through them, I learned about his private conversations, his real concerns about various proposals, and even his health problems that affected his decision-making. This knowledge allowed me to frame Florence's proposals in ways that addressed his unstated concerns, giving us significant advantages in negotiations. The key insight is that information gathering must be systematic and continuous, not episodic. Most people collect intelligence haphazardly, paying attention only when they need something specific. Effective intelligence networks operate constantly, gathering seemingly insignificant details that become valuable when combined with other information or when circumstances change. I developed what I called the concentric circles approach to information gathering. The inner circle consisted of people who could provide intelligence about my immediate objectives and threats. The middle circle included those who could offer context about broader political and economic trends. The outer circle encompassed anyone who might occasionally provide useful fragments of information about distant but potentially relevant developments. Modern applications of this principle are everywhere in your professional environment. The administrative assistant who schedules meetings often knows more about real organizational priorities than many managers. The IT technician who maintains email servers understands communication patterns that reveal actual relationships and influences. The person who handles expense reports sees spending patterns that illuminate strategic priorities. Building your intelligence network requires understanding what motivates people to share information. Some people enjoy feeling important and valued for their knowledge. Others appreciate being treated as insiders who understand the real dynamics of situations. Still others respond to reciprocal information sharing, where you provide valuable intelligence in exchange for what you need. The strategic value of secrets extends beyond their immediate content. Knowing something that others don't know gives you multiple advantages. You can anticipate developments before they become obvious. You can position yourself advantageously before opportunities become competitive, and you can avoid threats before they materialize into serious problems. But perhaps most importantly, the reputation for possessing good intelligence makes people more likely to share additional information with you. When others believe you understand the real dynamics of situations, they seek your perspective and often reveal their own intelligence in the process. I learned to protect my sources meticulously. Information networks are fragile once people believe their confidences aren't safe. They stop sharing valuable intelligence. I never revealed how I learned something unless absolutely necessary, and I often credited information to multiple possible sources to protect the real provider. During the turbulent period when the Medici were expelled from Florence, my intelligence network provided advance warning of the changing political winds. While others were caught off guard by rapidly shifting alliances, I was able to position myself strategically because I understood what was happening before it became public knowledge. In your modern context, information advantage often determines who gets promoted, who secures the best deals, and who avoids career-damaging mistakes. The person who knows about organizational changes before they're announced can position themselves for new opportunities. The person who understands client concerns before they become complaints can address problems proactively. Remember this, in any competitive environment, the person with the best information about other parties' real motivations, constraints, and alternatives holds the strongest position. Invest in developing your intelligence capabilities as seriously as you develop your technical skills. Both are essential for sustained success. The most brilliant strategy becomes worthless if executed at the wrong moment. During my years observing power dynamics, I discovered that timing often matters more than the content of your influence attempts. The same proposal that fails miserably in one circumstance can succeed dramatically in another, not because the proposal changed, but because the timing aligned with psychological and situational factors. I learned this lesson while watching Pope Julius II navigate the complex politics of the Italian wars. Julius possessed an intuitive understanding of when people were most susceptible to influence. He would wait until his targets were under pressure, financial stress, military threats, or political isolation before making his most important requests. When someone is drowning, they respond more favorably to offers of assistance than when they're safely on shore. During my diplomatic career, I identified several universal principles about the psychology of timing. People are most open to new ideas immediately after experiencing failure or disappointment with their current approach. They're most willing to make commitments when facing deadlines or time pressures. They're most receptive to authority when feeling uncertain or overwhelmed by complex decisions. The art lies in recognizing these windows of opportunity and being prepared to act when they open. I developed the habit of preparing multiple versions of important proposals, aggressive versions for when the other party was desperate, moderate versions for normal circumstances, and patient versions for when they held stronger positions. One of my most successful negotiations involved securing French support for Florence during a particularly vulnerable period. I had been attempting to gain King Louis XII's attention for months with little success. Then the Spanish threatened French territories in southern Italy, suddenly making Louis much more interested in Italian alliances. Within days, I secured commitments that had been impossible to obtain during months of previous efforts. The key insight is that people's decision-making frameworks change based on their circumstances. When someone feels secure and in control, they evaluate proposals conservatively, focusing on potential risks and downsides. When they feel threatened or pressured, they become more willing to accept risks in exchange for potential solutions to their immediate problems. Understanding individual timing patterns requires observing when each person is most and least receptive. Two different types of requests. Some people make their best decisions early in the day when their mental energy is highest. Others become more agreeable later in the day as their resistance to persuasion decreases. Some respond well to pressure, while others shut down when they feel rushed. I also discovered the power of creating artificial urgency when natural timing wasn't favorable. By introducing legitimate deadlines, limited availability, or competitive pressures, you can accelerate decision-making processes that might otherwise drag on indefinitely. The key is ensuring that the urgency feels authentic rather than manipulative. During the siege of Florence in 1512, I watched offenders make increasingly poor decisions as time pressure mounted. Proposals they had rejected weeks earlier suddenly seemed reasonable as their situation deteriorated. The attackers understood this psychological dynamic and timed their most generous surrender terms to coincide with moments of maximum pressure on the defenders. In modern contexts, understanding timing means recognizing when people are most open to change, most motivated to act, and most willing to commit resources. The manager who approaches their boss with a promotion request immediately after successfully completing a high-visibility project has better timing than one who makes the same request during budget cuts or organizational uncertainty. The psychology of decision-making windows also applies to group dynamics. Teams often cycle through periods of openness to new ideas and periods of resistance to change. Effective influencers learn to recognize these cycles in time. their most important proposals to coincide with receptive periods. I developed what I call the pressure gauge technique, constantly monitoring the stress levels, confidence, and circumstances of people I needed to influence. When someone's pressure gauge was high, they became more receptive to solutions and more willing to make decisive commitments. When their pressure was low, they could afford to be more selective and demanding. Remember this principle. The same influence attempt can produce completely different results depending on when it's deployed. Before making important requests or proposals, assess the other party's current circumstances, stress levels, and recent experiences. Time your approach to align with their psychological readiness to receive and act on your message. Throughout my career, I witnessed the rise and fall of countless alliances, and I came to understand that partnerships are tools, not relationships. The most successful leaders I observed, from Caesar Borgia to Pope Julius, two approached alliances with clear strategic thinking rather than emotional attachment. They formed partnerships when beneficial, maintained them as long as they served mutual interests, and dissolved them when circumstances changed. This pragmatic approach to alliances troubles those who believe partnerships should be based on loyalty and personal affection. But I learned that alliances founded on emotional bonds, rather than strategic value, often become liabilities when interests diverge. The partners who serve you best are those who benefit from your success, not necessarily those who like you most. During the formation of the League of Cambrai against Venice, I observed how Pope Julius II masterfully managed multiple competing interests. He aligned France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and several Italian states against a common threat. Despite the fact that these same powers had been enemies in previous conflicts, each partner received specific benefits that outweighed their historical grievances, creating a functional alliance despite underlying tensions. The key insight is that effective alliances are built on complementary needs rather than similar values. The strongest partnerships emerge when each party possesses resources or capabilities that the other requires, creating mutual dependency that transcends personal relationships or ideological alignment. I developed a systematic approach to alliance evaluation based on 3 criteria: capability, reliability, and alignment of interests. Capability meant assessing whether potential partners actually possessed the resources or skills needed to contribute meaningfully to shared objectives. Reliability involved evaluating their track record of honoring commitments and maintaining confidentiality. Alignment required understanding whether their fundamental interests would continue to align with yours as circumstances evolved. Building coalitions for specific objectives requires understanding the concept of temporary partnerships. Not every alliance needs to be permanent or comprehensive. Some of my most successful diplomatic initiatives involved creating short-term coalitions focused on single issues, allowing partners to cooperate in one area while competing in others. During negotiations over territorial disputes between Florence and its neighbors, I often formed temporary alliances with parties who shared our immediate interests but might become competitors in future conflicts. These limited partnerships allowed us to achieve specific objectives without creating unrealistic expectations about broader cooperation. The art of alliance management includes knowing when to abandon partnerships that no longer serve your interests. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect for many people, who feel that dissolving alliances represents personal betrayal. But maintaining alliances beyond their useful life often prevents you from forming new partnerships that better serve your current needs. I watched Cesare Borgia demonstrate this principle repeatedly. He would form alliances with local commanders when he needed their military support, then eliminate them when they became potential threats to his consolidated power. While this approach seemed ruthless, It reflected clear strategic thinking about the temporary nature of many political partnerships. The modern applications of these principles are evident in every professional environment. The colleague who helps you complete a crucial project becomes a valuable alliance for that specific objective. But if your career paths diverge or your interests conflict in other areas, maintaining that alliance might prevent you from forming new partnerships that better serve your current goals. Managing multiple competing interests requires sophisticated communication and boundary management. Often, your various allies will have conflicting interests with each other, requiring you to maintain separate relationships without creating the impression of duplicity or unreliability. I developed the practice of being transparent about the limitations of each alliance. Rather than pretending comprehensive agreement where none existed, I would clearly define the scope and duration of each partnership. This honesty actually strengthened alliances by setting realistic expectations and preventing future disappointments. Understanding when alliances naturally expire is crucial for maintaining your reputation for reliability. Partnerships that serve specific projects or time-limited objectives should be gracefully concluded when those objectives are met. Attempting to extend alliances beyond their natural lifespan often creates conflicts that damage all parties involved. Remember this: alliances are strategic tools that should be formed, maintained, and dissolved based on their contribution to your objectives. The most effective alliance builders focus on creating mutual value rather than personal loyalty, understanding that the strongest partnerships are those where each party benefits from the other's success. Power is largely performance, and those who understand this fundamental truth wield influence far beyond what their actual resources might suggest. During my time observing various rulers and leaders, I discovered that the appearance of authority often matters more than its substance. People respond to the symbols and presentation of power as much as they respond to power itself. Pope Alexander VI was a master of this theatrical approach to authority. Despite facing constant political threats and having limited military resources, he commanded respect throughout Europe through carefully orchestrated displays of papal majesty. His public appearances were choreographed performances designed to reinforce perceptions of divine authority and temporal power. Even his enemies found themselves unconsciously deferring to the symbols of his office. I learned this lesson personally during my diplomatic missions. When representing Florence in foreign courts, my effectiveness depended not just on the strength of my proposals, but on how convincingly I could project the authority of the Florentine Republic. My dress, my manner of speaking, even my choice of accommodations all contributed to perceptions of Florence's power and stability. The key insight is that people make rapid judgments about authority based on visual and behavioral cues, often before they have any substantive information about actual capabilities. These initial impressions then influence all subsequent interactions, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where perceived authority generates real influence. Creating your authoritative image requires understanding the specific symbols and behaviors that signal power in your environment. In Renaissance courts, this meant certain styles of dress, patterns of speech, and methods of conducting business. In modern contexts, it might involve your professional presentation, your communication style, or your command of relevant expertise. During my observations of Cesare Borgia, I noticed how he used ceremony and ritual to reinforce his authority. Important announcements were made with formal pageantry that emphasized the significance of his decisions. Even routine meetings were conducted with enough formality to remind participants of his elevated status. These weren't empty gestures, they were strategic communications that reinforced power dynamics. The psychology of status symbols operates on both conscious and unconscious levels. People consciously recognize certain markers of authority and success, but they also respond unconsciously to more subtle signals of confidence, competence, and control. Mastering both levels of communication exponentially increases your perceived authority. I developed what I call the authority framework, a systematic approach to projecting competence and control in any situation. This framework included verbal elements like speaking with certainty and avoiding unnecessary qualifiers, physical elements like maintaining confident posture and eye contact, and strategic elements like demonstrating knowledge of relevant details and displaying comfort with decision-making. Responsibilities. Building executive presence in modern contexts requires understanding how authority is communicated in your specific environment. The behaviors that signal leadership in a technology company might differ from those that work in a financial institution or government agency. Effective authority builders study successful leaders in their field and adapt those presentation patterns to their own style. But theatrical authority must be supported by genuine competence to maintain credibility over time. The performance of power creates opportunities to demonstrate real capabilities, but if those capabilities don't exist, the illusion eventually collapses. The most sustainable approach combines authentic expertise with strategic presentation. I observed this principle during the decline of various Italian city-states. Leaders who relied solely on the trappings of authority without developing genuine strategic capabilities eventually lost credibility when their decisions produced poor results. Conversely, leaders who combined real competence with effective presentation maintained influence even during difficult periods. The ceremonial aspects of authority serve important psychological functions beyond mere impression management. Formal procedures and ritualized interactions help establish clear hierarchies and expectations, reducing uncertainty and conflict. In complex organizational environments, when people understand their roles in these ceremonies, they can focus their energy on substantive contributions rather than navigating unclear social dynamics. Using ceremony and ritual to reinforce influence doesn't require elaborate productions. Simple practices like conducting important meetings with appropriate formality, taking time to acknowledge significant achievements, and maintaining consistent standards for important communications all contribute to an atmosphere that reinforces your authority. Remember this principle. Authority is as much about perception as reality, and perception can be influenced through strategic presentation. Invest in understanding and practicing the behaviors, symbols, and ceremonies that communicate competence and control in your environment, but ensure that your performance is supported by genuine capabilities that can deliver on the expectations you create. Your reputation precedes you into every room, every negotiation, and every relationship. It opens doors that money cannot buy and closes opportunities that talent alone cannot secure. During my years in the treacherous world of Renaissance politics, I learned that managing perception is not about deception. It's about ensuring that the truth about your capabilities and character reaches the right people in the right way. I witnessed the power of reputation management through observing Lorenzo de' Medici, who ruled Florence not through formal title but through carefully cultivated perception of wisdom, generosity, and strength. Lorenzo understood that reputation is built through countless small actions and communications, each one contributing to an overall narrative that influences how people approach you and what they expect from interactions with you. The foundation of effective reputation management is understanding that people form impressions based on limited information, then interpret all subsequent evidence through the lens of those initial impressions. If someone believes you are competent and trustworthy, they will interpret ambiguous situations in your favor. If they doubt your capabilities, they will focus on evidence that confirms their skepticism. During my diplomatic missions, I learned to shape initial impressions through strategic preparation. Before arriving at any court, I would ensure that favorable information about my previous successes and Florence's capabilities reached key decision-makers through indirect channels. When I finally met with officials, they approached our discussions with positive expectations that made productive negotiations more likely. The art of controlling narrative around your actions requires understanding the difference between what happens and what people believe happened. Events themselves are often less important than how they are interpreted and remembered. The same outcome can be framed as brilliant strategy or lucky accident, depending on how the story is told and by whom. I observed this principle during Cesare Borgia's conquest of the Romagna. When Borgia's forces captured a well-fortified city with minimal casualties, he ensured that accounts of the victory emphasized his strategic planning and the superiority of his military organization. When luck favored him during a siege, he presented it as the inevitable result of superior preparation. The facts remained the same, but the narrative reinforced perceptions of his capabilities. Building and protecting reputation requires a systematic approach to communication. Every interaction, every decision, and every public statement contributes to your overall image. Effective reputation managers think several moves ahead, considering how current actions will be perceived and what stories people will tell about them. The strategic use of public relations extends beyond formal communications to include the cultivation of influential allies who will speak favorably about your capabilities and character. During my time in government, I maintained relationships with merchants, scholars, and diplomats who traveled widely and could share positive accounts of my work with people I might never meet personally. Managing both positive and negative perceptions requires different strategies. Building positive reputation involves consistent demonstration of your capabilities and values over time. Protecting against negative perceptions requires rapid response to misinformation and proactive communication during challenging situations. I learned about crisis management during my fall from power in 1512, when political winds shifted and I lost my position. Malicious rumors about my loyalty and competence spread rapidly. Those who had respected my work suddenly questioned my judgment. I realized that reputation, once damaged, requires exponentially more effort to repair than it took to build originally. The key to reputation recovery is acknowledging legitimate concerns while providing evidence that contradicts false narratives. During my exile, I continued producing analytical work that demonstrated my strategic thinking abilities, gradually rebuilding credibility with those who valued intellectual competence over political position. Modern applications of these principles are essential in professional environments where your reputation often determines which opportunities you're offered and how seriously your ideas are taken. The person known for delivering exceptional results will be given challenging assignments that create further opportunities for advancement. The person with a reputation for reliability will be trusted with sensitive information and important relationships. Remember this: reputation is your most valuable strategic asset, and like all assets, it requires active management and protection. Every action and communication either builds or undermines the perception others have of your capabilities and character. Invest in reputation management as seriously as you invest in developing your actual skills. Both are essential for sustained influence and success. Most people avoid conflict, viewing it as a sign of failure or breakdown in relationships. But during my years studying power dynamics, I discovered that strategic conflict, carefully initiated and controlled, can serve your interests far better than artificial harmony. The key insight is distinguishing between destructive conflict that damages all parties and constructive conflict that advances your objectives while strengthening your position. I learned this principle through observing Pope Julius II, who was known as the warrior pope for his willingness to engage in strategic conflicts, Julius understood that sometimes you must create controlled opposition to clarify positions, test loyalties, and demonstrate strength. When various Italian states were hesitating to support papal policies, Julius would deliberately create situations that forced them to choose sides, eliminating the comfortable middle ground that allowed them to avoid commitment. The strategic value of controlled conflict lies in its ability to reveal true intentions and capabilities. During periods of artificial peace, people can maintain ambiguous positions and hidden agendas. When conflict emerges, these ambiguities disappear. You discover who will support you under pressure, who will abandon you when stakes rise, and who possesses real influence versus mere reputation. I applied this principle during my diplomatic career when negotiating with parties who were stalling or making unrealistic demands. Rather than accepting endless delays, I would sometimes create artificial deadlines or competitive pressures that forced decisions. The resulting tension revealed their true priorities and constraints, enabling more productive negotiations. Creating controlled opposition can also strengthen your position by demonstrating your ability to handle challenges. When others see you successfully navigate conflict, your reputation for strength and competence increases. Conversely, leaders who avoid all conflict often appear weak or indecisive when serious challenges eventually arise. During the siege of Florence, I observed how defenders who fought back strategically gained more favorable surrender terms than those who capitulated immediately. The attackers respected opponents who could create costs for victory, viewing them as worthy of negotiated settlements rather than unconditional surrender. The art lies in initiating conflict on terms favorable to you, where your strengths match up well against your opponent's weaknesses. This requires careful assessment of relative capabilities and strategic positioning before engaging. Random or emotional conflict usually serves no one's interests and often damages all parties involved. Using competition to motivate and control others is another application of strategic conflict principles. When I managed diplomatic teams, I would sometimes create competitive dynamics between different approaches or individuals, allowing the best strategies to emerge through controlled rivalry rather than imposing solutions from above. The difference between destructive and constructive conflict lies in maintaining clear objectives and boundaries. Destructive conflict becomes personal, escalates beyond its original scope, and continues after its purpose has been served. Constructive conflict remains focused on specific issues, maintains professional boundaries, and concludes when objectives are achieved. I developed what I called the controlled pressure technique, gradually increasing stakes or tension until the other party reveals their true position or capabilities, then adjusting my approach based on this new information. This method often avoided the need for major confrontations by resolving underlying issues before they escalated. In modern contexts, strategic conflict might involve challenging unrealistic deadlines to establish more reasonable expectations, pushing back against unfair policies to demonstrate your value, or creating competitive situations that motivate better performance from your team or colleagues. The timing of strategic conflict is crucial. Engaging when you hold strong positions and your opponents are vulnerable maximizes your chances of favorable outcomes. Avoiding conflict when you're weak or unprepared allows problems to grow larger and more difficult to resolve. Understanding when conflict serves your strategic interests requires analyzing the current balance of power, the costs and benefits of confrontation, and the likely outcomes under different scenarios. Sometimes accepting short-term harmony preserves resources for more important battles. Other times, early conflict prevents larger problems from developing. Managing conflict requires emotional discipline and strategic thinking. The goal is never conflict for its own sake, but using controlled tension to advance your objectives and strengthen your position. Effective conflict managers remain focused on outcomes rather than emotions, maintaining professional relationships even during periods of opposition. Remember this principle. Avoiding all conflict often means accepting unfavorable conditions and allowing problems to grow larger. Strategic conflict, carefully managed and focused on specific objectives, can clarify relationships, demonstrate strength, and create more favorable conditions for future interactions. Human behavior responds to consequences more reliably than to appeals to conscience or logic. Throughout my observations of successful leaders, I discovered that those who understood the psychology of behavioral conditioning could shape actions and attitudes with remarkable precision. The key insight is that people do more of what brings positive consequences and less of what brings negative ones, but only when those consequences are clearly connected to their behavior. Cesare Borgia was a master of this principle. When he conquered new territories, he would immediately establish clear systems of rewards for cooperation and punishments for resistance. Local nobles who submitted quickly received confirmations of their properties and positions. Those who delayed faced confiscation of lands in exile. This pattern became so predictable that later conquests often surrendered without resistance. Having learned from others' experiences, the effectiveness of any consequence system depends on three factors: certainty, timing, and magnitude. Certainty means that consequences consistently follow the behaviors they're meant to influence. Timing requires that consequences occur close enough to the behavior that the connection is obvious. Magnitude ensures that the consequences are significant, enough to motivate behavioral change. During my diplomatic career, I learned to create these conditions systematically. When working with officials who honored their commitments, I ensured they received recognition and future opportunities. When dealing with those who broke promises, I made certain that their unreliability became known to others they might need to work with. These weren't acts of revenge, but strategic communications that reinforced beneficial behavior patterns. The psychology of behavioral conditioning operates largely below conscious awareness. People don't necessarily think through relationships rationally. Instead, they develop emotional associations between behaviors and outcomes that guide future decisions. Effective influence builders understand this unconscious process and design consequence systems that create positive associations with desired behaviors. Creating systems that naturally influence behavior requires understanding what each person truly values as rewards and fears as punishments. For some, public recognition is highly motivating, while private criticism is devastating. For others, financial incentives matter most, while public attention feels uncomfortable. Effective consequence systems are tailored to individual motivational patterns. I observed this during various military campaigns, where successful commanders understood that different soldiers responded to different types of motivation. Some fought harder for glory and recognition, others for material rewards, still others to avoid shame or punishment. The most effective military leaders used varied approaches based on their understanding of individual psychology. The timing and magnitude of consequences must be calibrated carefully. Immediate small consequences often influence behavior more effectively than delayed large ones. People respond more strongly to losing something they already possess than to gaining something they don't have. Intermittent reinforcements, rewarding desired behavior and sometimes not, can actually be more powerful than consistent rewards. During my time managing diplomatic staff, I learned that unexpected recognition often motivated people more than routine acknowledgments. When someone exceeded expectations, I would sometimes arrange for them to receive acknowledgement from senior officials they respected, creating memorable positive associations with exceptional performance. Building influence through consistent reinforcement requires patience and systematic thinking. You must identify the specific behaviors you want to encourage or discourage, then create consequence patterns that support those objectives. This isn't manipulation, it's clear communication about what actions lead to positive or negative outcomes. The most sophisticated consequence systems operate through natural results rather than artificial punishments or rewards. When people experience the logical outcomes of their choices, they learn more effectively than when consequences feel arbitrary or imposed. Effective leaders structure situations so that beneficial behaviors naturally lead to positive results. Developed the practice of making consequence patterns explicit when possible, rather than letting people discover through experience what behaviors led to what outcomes. I would often explain the connection directly. This transparency actually increased the effectiveness of the system by helping people make conscious choices about their actions. Modern applications of these principles are everywhere in professional environments. The manager who consistently recognizes good work and addresses poor performance creates clear behavioral expectations. The colleague who reliably follows through on commitments and experiences positive results from this reliability builds a reputation that leads to future opportunities. Understanding the compound effect of behavioral patterns helps explain why small consequences can have large, long-term impacts. Behaviors that are consistently reinforced become habits that shape personality and reputation over time. Effective influence builders think beyond immediate outcomes to consider how current consequence patterns will affect future behavior and relationships. Remember this: people learn from consequences more than from conversations. If you want to influence behavior consistently, create clear, timely, and meaningful connections between actions and outcomes. This approach respects people's intelligence while recognizing the psychological realities of how behavioral change actually occurs. Power multiplies through the right people, and the most influential leaders I observed understood that building a strategic inner circle was essential for sustained success. Your closest advisors and confidants don't just support your decisions, they extend your capabilities, amplify your influence, and protect your interests when you cannot be present. But choosing these relationships requires careful, strategic thinking, not just personal affinity. During my time observing Lorenzo de' Medici, I learned that an effective inner circle serves multiple functions simultaneously. These trusted individuals provide honest feedback when others tell you what they think you want to hear. They possess complementary skills that cover your weaknesses. They extend your influence into areas where you cannot operate directly. And they offer loyalty based on mutual benefit rather than temporary convenience. The key insight is that inner circle relationships must be based on genuine value exchange, not just personal chemistry. The people closest to you should bring capabilities, connections, or perspectives that enhance your strategic position. Friendship without strategic value may be personally satisfying, but it doesn't contribute to your influence and effectiveness. I learned this lesson when I had to rebuild my network after falling from power in 1512. Those who remained loyal during my exile were not necessarily the people I had liked most during my time in government, but those who continued to benefit from association with my knowledge and strategic thinking. This taught me that sustainable inner circles are built on ongoing mutual value rather than historical relationships. Identifying and cultivating key influencers requires understanding the informal power structure in any organization or community. The people with formal titles are not always those with real influence. Often, the most valuable inner circle members are those who possess influence without obvious authority, people others trust and consult when making important decisions. During my diplomatic missions, I learned to identify these informal influencers by observing communication patterns and decision-making processes. Who did official leaders consult privately before making announcements? Whose opinions carried weight in group discussions? Who had access to information before it became widely available? These people often became more valuable allies than those with impressive titles, but limited real influence. Managing your closest advisors and confidants requires balancing competing priorities. You need people who will tell you uncomfortable truths, but also people who will support your decisions loyally once they're made. You need individuals with different perspectives and expertise, but also people who can work together effectively. When necessary, I developed what I call the Council of Perspectives. Approach deliberately, including people in my inner circle who approached problems from different angles. This might include someone focused on immediate practical concerns, another who thought about long-term consequences, and a third who understood political and relationship dynamics. This diversity of thinking helped me avoid blind spots that could lead to strategic mistakes. The dangers and benefits of inner circles are equally significant. The benefits include enhanced decision-making, extended influence, and loyal support during challenging periods. The dangers include groupthink, isolation from broader perspectives, and the risk that inner circle members will pursue their own interests at your expense. Creating loyalty through exclusive access requires offering genuine value that people cannot obtain elsewhere. This might be access to important information, introduction to valuable contacts, or involvement in significant decisions. The key is ensuring that inner circle membership provides real benefits that justify the loyalty and discretion you require. I observed this principle during Cesare Borgia's rise to power. Borgia created intense loyalty among his inner circle by including them in strategic planning, sharing sensitive information that demonstrated his trust, and ensuring that their personal success was tied to his success. These people became extensions of his will because they understood that their fortunes were linked to his. Building and maintaining your personal cabinet requires ongoing attention to relationship dynamics and individual motivations. People's circumstances and interests change over time, and inner circle relationships must evolve accordingly. Someone who is valuable during one phase of your career might become less relevant as your objectives change. The composition of your inner circle should reflect your current strategic priorities while maintaining core relationships that provide continuity and institutional memory. As you advance in your career or shift your focus, you may need to gradually adjust your closest advisors while maintaining positive relationships with those who are no longer central to your immediate objectives. Modern applications of inner circle strategy are essential in professional environments where success depends on collaboration and relationship management. The executive who builds strong relationships with key stakeholders, trusted advisors, and influential colleagues creates a support network that enhances their effectiveness and protects their interests. During organizational changes, understanding the balance between loyalty and performance ensures that your inner circle contributes to your success rather than simply providing comfortable relationships. The most effective inner circles combine personal loyalty with professional competence, creating relationships that are both personally satisfying and strategically valuable. Remember this: your inner circle is your most important strategic asset, extending your capabilities and amplifying your influence far beyond what you could achieve alone. Choose these relationships based on complementary strengths and mutual value. Then invest in maintaining them through consistent attention and genuine care for their success and well-being. Opposition is inevitable when you pursue ambitious objectives, and those who fail to address it strategically often find themselves overwhelmed by forces they could have neutralized through careful planning. During my years observing political dynamics, I learned that the most dangerous threats are not always the most obvious ones, and the most effective responses are rarely direct confrontation. The first principle of neutralizing opposition is accurate threat assessment. Not every person who disagrees with you poses a real threat to your objectives. Not every critic has the influence or capability to damage your interests significantly. Effective strategic thinking requires distinguishing between minor irritations and genuine threats that require serious attention. I learned this distinction through observing how different leaders responded to criticism and opposition. Some exhausted themselves fighting every minor disagreement, while others ignored serious threats until they became overwhelming. The most successful leaders I observed focused their defensive efforts on opponents who possessed both the motivation and capability to inflict real damage. During my diplomatic career, I developed a systematic approach to threat evaluation based on three factors: motivation, capability, and opportunity. Motivation involved understanding why someone opposed my objectives and how intensely they felt about the conflict. Capability required assessing what resources, influence, or skills they could bring to bear against my interests. Opportunity meant evaluating whether circumstances would allow them to act effectively on their opposition. Strategies for undermining opposition without direct confrontation often prove more effective than open conflict. Direct attacks on opponents can generate sympathy for them, unite their supporters, and escalate conflicts beyond their original scope. Indirect approaches allow you to weaken opposition while maintaining your reputation and avoiding unnecessary battles. One of the most powerful indirect strategies is strategic isolation, gradually reducing an opponent's influence and support network without attacking them personally. This approach works by addressing the interests and concerns of their allies, making it less attractive for others to support their position. As their coalition weakens, opponents often find themselves unable to act effectively, even if their motivation remains strong. I observed this technique during various political upheavals in Italian city-states. Successful leaders would identify key supporters of their opponents and address their concerns through separate negotiations or inducements. As these supporters gradually shifted to neutral positions or active support, the original opponents found themselves increasingly isolated and ineffective. Converting enemies into allies represents the highest form of strategic thinking about opposition. Rather than simply defeating opponents, this approach transforms opposition into support, actually strengthening your position while eliminating threats. This conversion requires understanding what your opponents truly want and finding ways to satisfy those desires through alignment with your objectives. During negotiations between competing political factions, I sometimes found opportunities to offer former opponents roles or benefits that served both their interests and mine. Someone who had opposed my diplomatic initiatives due to concerns about Florentine influence might become a supporter if given a role in shaping how that influence was exercised. The art of strategic isolation operates through patient relationship building and careful communication rather than dramatic confrontations. You systematically address the concerns of your opponent's supporters, demonstrate the benefits of cooperation with your initiatives, and create costs for continued opposition that outweigh the benefits. I developed what I call the coalition erosion strategy, gradually building relationships with people in your opponent's network who might be open to alternative approaches. This process requires understanding the internal dynamics and tensions within opposing groups, then offering attractive alternatives to key individuals who might be willing to reconsider their positions. Neutralizing threats without creating martyrs or escalating conflicts requires sophistication and patience. The goal is to reduce opposition influence while maintaining your reputation for fairness and reasonableness. Actions that appear vindictive or excessive often generate sympathy for your opponents, and encourage others to view you as a threat. Modern techniques for competitive advantage focus on building superior value propositions rather than directly attacking competitors. Instead of undermining other approaches, you demonstrate the benefits of your approach so clearly that alternatives become less attractive. This positive positioning often proves more effective than negative campaigning against opponents. Understanding the difference between neutralizing threats and eliminating competition helps maintain ethical boundaries while protecting your interests. Genuine threats to your success or well-being may require decisive action, but routine competition should be addressed through superior performance rather than strategic opposition. The psychology of conflict resolution often reveals that many apparent opponents are actually potential allies who have been approached incorrectly or at the wrong time. Before assuming that opposition is permanent, consider whether the underlying interests can be aligned through creative problem-solving or mutual benefit creation. Remember this: opposition often signals areas where your approach could be improved or where important interests have been overlooked. The most sophisticated response to opposition involves understanding its sources, addressing legitimate concerns when possible, and strategically neutralizing threats that cannot be resolved through accommodation or compromise. True power transcends individual relationships and temporary positions. The most sophisticated leaders I observed understood that sustainable influence requires building systems that outlast personal connections and political changes. While others focused on immediate gains and short-term victories, masters of the long game created institutional power that continued working even when they were absent or circumstances shifted dramatically. Lorenzo de' Medici exemplified this approach during his rule of Florence. Rather than relying solely on personal relationships or formal authority, Lorenzo built a network of institutions, traditions, and mutual dependencies that reinforced Medici influence across multiple generations. His power resided not just in his individual capabilities, but in the systems he created that made Medici leadership seem natural and necessary. The key insight is that personal power diminishes with age, health, and changing circumstances, but institutional power can compound over time. Building influence systems that outlast individual relationships requires thinking beyond immediate objectives to consider how current actions will affect future opportunities and constraints. During my years in government, I learned to distinguish between positions that depended on personal relationships and those that were embedded in organizational structures. Personal power required constant maintenance through relationship management and individual performance. Institutional power, once established, operated through systems and processes that influenced behavior regardless of who occupied specific roles. Creating institutional power versus personal power requires understanding how organizations and communities actually function beyond their formal structures. The written rules and official procedures tell only part of the story. Real influence often flows through informal networks, unwritten traditions, and cultural expectations that shape behavior more powerfully than formal authority. I observed this principle during the various political transitions in Italian city-states. Leaders who had built their influence around personal relationships often lost power completely when political winds shifted. Those who had embedded their influence in institutional processes and cultural patterns maintained significant leverage even during periods when they held no formal positions. Planning for succession and legacy requires accepting that your personal involvement in important initiatives will eventually end, but ensuring that the principles and systems you've established continue operating effectively. This long-term thinking influences how you structure current projects and relationships. The compound effect of strategic influence becomes apparent when you consider how small, consistent actions accumulate over time. A reputation for reliability, built through years of consistent behavior, becomes more valuable than any single impressive achievement. Networks of mutual obligation, developed through patient relationship building, provide more sustainable influence than dramatic demonstrations of power. During my exile from Florence, I experienced both sides of this dynamic. My formal political power disappeared overnight, but the intellectual influence of my writings and the relationships I built over years continued to provide opportunities and protection. The ideas I had developed through systematic observation proved more durable than the superficial positions I had held. Sustainable influence in changing environments requires building adaptive systems rather than rigid structures. The most effective institutional power can flex with changing circumstances while maintaining core functions and relationships. This adaptability comes from understanding underlying principles rather than depending on specific procedures or arrangements. I developed what I call the principle-based influence approach, focusing on establishing fundamental patterns of thought and behavior that could adapt to different situations while maintaining essential characteristics. Instead of trying to control specific outcomes, this approach influences how people think about problems and evaluate solutions. Modern applications of long-game thinking are essential in rapidly changing professional environments. The person who builds a reputation for developing others' capabilities creates influence that extends far beyond their immediate team or organization. The leader who establishes decision-making frameworks and cultural values shapes behavior long after they've moved to other roles. Understanding the difference between temporal advantage and sustainable influence helps prioritize where to invest your time and energy. Temporary advantages might provide immediate benefits, but they require constant effort to maintain and can disappear quickly when circumstances change. Sustainable influence, once established, continues working with minimal maintenance and often grows stronger over time. The psychological aspects of legacy building involve accepting that your most important contributions might not be immediately visible or personally credited to you. The ideas you share, the people you develop, and the systems you establish often have their greatest impact years after you've established them, sometimes in ways you never anticipated. Building systems that operate independently of your direct involvement requires documenting principles, training successors, and creating self-reinforcing patterns that continue without constant supervision. This systematic thinking about sustainability often determines whether your influence continues growing or diminishes when your personal attention shifts to other priorities. Remember this: the most sophisticated form of power is influence that continues working when you're not present and grows stronger over time through compound effects. Focus on building systems, relationships, and reputations that will serve your long-term interests while adapting to changing circumstances and opportunities. The principles of strategic influence that governed Renaissance politics remain remarkably relevant in your modern world, though their applications have evolved dramatically with technology and changing social structures. What I learned about human nature in Italian courts applies directly to corporate boardrooms, digital communications, and global business relationships. The fundamental drives and psychological patterns I observed have not changed, only the environments in which they operate. Adapting Renaissance strategies to digital communication requires understanding that virtual interactions follow the same basic patterns as face-to-face relationships, but with important modifications. The principles of timing, information management, and reputation building all apply to digital environments, but the speed and scale of modern communications create both new opportunities and new risks. In digital communications, your written words replace physical presence as the primary means of projecting authority and competence. The careful word choice and strategic timing that I used in diplomatic correspondence becomes even more important when email, messaging, and social media serve as your primary influence tools. Every written communication contributes to perceptions of your competence and character. The strategic revelation of information, which I practiced in face-to-face negotiations, translates directly to modern business communications. The person who reveals information strategically in email negotiations maintains advantages over those who share everything immediately. The timing of responses, the depth of detail provided, and the sequencing of revelations all influence outcomes. In digital negotiations, influence in virtual teams and remote relationships requires adapting traditional relationship-building techniques to environments where casual interactions and informal communications are limited. The favor-building and obligation management principles I developed for court relationships become more important when you cannot rely on frequent face-to-face interactions to maintain connections. Building your intelligence network in remote work environments involves systematically cultivating information sources across different virtual channels and platforms. The administrative coordinator who manages video conference schedules possesses valuable intelligence about organizational priorities. The technical support person who maintains communication systems understands actual workflow patterns that reveal real power structures. Social media and digital reputation management operate on the same fundamental principles I observed in Renaissance courts, but with unprecedented speed and scale. A single communication can reach thousands of people instantly, making reputation management both more important and more challenging than ever before. The cascading effects of digital communications mean that strategic thinking about reputation requires considering not just immediate audiences, but how messages might be shared, interpreted, and remembered across extended networks. The same careful consideration I gave to diplomatic messages now applies to professional social media posts, email communications, and any digital content associated with your name. Global business applications of classical influence principles reveal that human psychology transcends cultural boundaries, though specific tactics must be adapted to different cultural contexts. The fundamental drives of fear, greed, and pride operate across all cultures, but their specific manifestations and appropriate responses vary significantly between different societies and business environments. Understanding cultural variations in authority perception, relationship building, and conflict resolution allows you to adapt influence strategies to international business contexts. What signals competence and trustworthiness in one culture might appear arrogant or unreliable in another. Effective global influence requires studying these variations while applying consistent underlying principles. The alliance-building strategies I learned in Renaissance politics translate directly to modern strategic partnerships and business networking. The same principles of complementary capabilities, mutual benefit, and strategic timing that governed political alliances apply to professional relationships, business partnerships, and career development networks. Ethical considerations in modern influence become more complex when your actions can affect larger numbers of people and when digital communications create permanent records of your strategies and decisions. The same techniques that were acceptable in Renaissance courts might raise ethical questions when applied to modern employees, customers, or business partners. The key ethical principle I developed distinguishing between strategic information management and active deception becomes even more important in modern contexts where your communications might be scrutinized by regulators, journalists, or legal authorities. Strategic influence must operate within legal and ethical boundaries, while still providing competitive advantages. Technology amplifies both the power and the risks of strategic influence. The same digital tools that allow you to build extensive networks, and gather intelligence also create permanent records that could damage your reputation if your strategies are revealed inappropriately. Modern influence practitioners must balance strategic thinking with transparency and ethical behavior. Understanding the accelerated pace of modern decision-making requires adapting the timing principles I learned in Renaissance negotiations. What once took months of careful positioning might now need to happen in days or weeks, requiring more rapid assessment and response while maintaining strategic thinking about consequences and relationships. The compound effects of digital communications mean that strategic influence decisions have longer-lasting impacts than ever before. A thoughtful approach to modern influence considers not just immediate objectives, but how current communications and relationships will affect future opportunities in an increasingly connected world. Modern, strategic influence succeeds when it combines timeless principles of human psychology with contemporary understanding of technology, ethics, and global business practices. The same strategic thinking that enabled survival and success in Renaissance politics can provide significant advantages in today's competitive professional environment when applied thoughtfully and ethically. As I reflect on everything I have shared with you about the nature of power and influence, I want you to understand that mastery of these principles brings both tremendous opportunity and significant responsibility. The same techniques that can advance your career and improve your effectiveness can also cause harm if applied without wisdom and ethical consideration. Throughout my life, I observed that the most successful practitioners of strategic influence were those who understood its proper scope and limitations. Power is a tool, not an end in itself. The techniques I have taught you should serve larger purposes, building better organizations, creating value for others, and contributing to outcomes that benefit not just yourself, but the communities and institutions you serve. The synthesis of all strategic influence principles reveals a fundamental truth. Sustainable success comes from creating value for others while advancing your own interests. The most powerful people I observed were not those who exploited others ruthlessly, but those who found ways to align their success with the success of those around them. Cesare Borgia's ultimate failure came not from lack of strategic skill, but from focusing too heavily on personal power without building genuine value for his subjects. Pope Julius II's lasting influence came from advancing causes larger than himself, while using strategic principles to achieve those objectives. Lorenzo de' Medici's legacy endured because he created prosperity and cultural advancement for Florence, while building his family's influence. The responsibilities that come with influence mastery include using your capabilities to help others develop their own strategic thinking, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and ensuring that your success contributes to, rather than detracts from, the well-being of your broader community. When you can predict and influence behavior effectively, you have an obligation to use that power ethically and constructively. This means being honest about your intentions when possible, keeping confidences that have been shared with you, and avoiding the use of influence techniques to manipulate people into decisions that serve only your interests at their expense. Building a legacy through strategic relationships requires thinking beyond immediate gains to consider how your influence affects others' long-term development and success. The most meaningful legacy comes from developing others' capabilities, not just using them to achieve your objectives. During my years of exile, I had time to consider which of my actions I was most proud of and which I regretted. The decisions I valued most were those where I had used strategic thinking to help others succeed while advancing larger causes. The decisions I regretted were those where I had focused solely on immediate, tactical advantages without considering broader consequences. The final wisdom on human nature and power that I want to share is this: people respond to strength, but They remember kindness. The influence you build through demonstrating competence and strategic thinking creates opportunities. But the relationships you maintain through genuine care and mutual respect determine whether those opportunities become lasting success. Strategic influence should enhance rather than replace authentic human connection. The techniques I have taught you work best when they serve genuine relationships and mutual interests, not when they substitute for honest communication and real value creation. As you apply these principles in your own life and career, remember that their ultimate purpose is to help you become more effective at achieving worthwhile objectives, not to enable you to manipulate others for selfish purposes. The distinction between strategic thinking and manipulation lies in whether your actions serve shared interests or only personal advantage. The most sophisticated practitioners of influence understand that their reputation for ethical behavior is their most valuable strategic asset. Once people believe you will exploit them for personal gain, they become defensive and resistant to your influence. Regardless of your technical skills in persuasion and relationship management, my personal, farewell, and lasting inspiration to you is this: use what I have taught you to become the kind of person others want to work with, follow, and support. Build your influence through creating value, solving problems, and helping others succeed. Use strategic thinking to navigate complex situations more effectively, not to gain unfair advantages over others. The principles you have learned will serve you throughout your career and personal life, but they will serve you best when applied with wisdom, integrity, and genuine concern for the well-being of those affected by your decisions. Power without purpose becomes empty ambition. Strategy without ethics becomes manipulation. Influence without genuine value creation becomes exploitation. But when you combine strategic thinking with worthy objectives and ethical behavior, you become capable of achievements that benefit not just yourself, but everyone whose lives you touch. This is my legacy to you: the knowledge to understand and influence human behavior, combined with the wisdom to use that knowledge responsibly. Apply these principles well, and you will find that true power comes not from controlling others, but from inspiring them to achieve their own excellence while contributing to shared success. The world needs people who can think strategically and act ethically. Use what you have learned to become one of them.